Welcome, 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 everyone. My name is Niki Lopez of Niki Lopez Creative, and you're watching The Circle, where every Tuesday, 8:30 to 9 p.m., I'm talking to artists, activists, social entrepreneurs, grassroots organizations, and just people doing great things in the world today. And so today, I have a very special guest and friend. We have LJ Woolston. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. And let me just click on a couple things here while people are getting online. So LJ Woolston is an activist, a speaker, and the founder of Transpire Trainings and Consulting LLC and South Florida, and one of the co-founders of South Florida Mutual Aid Coalition. And so let's see, we have here. Okay. We got them going in. So I just want to take a moment and read a little bit about your bio before we jump in, because you do a lot of different things, and I want to make sure that we kind of touch on all of these things. So LJ Woolston is a Miami-born queer and trans non-binary advocate, activist, and social worker, and is also a dynamic speaker, facilitator, and trainer. LJ spent many years serving the LGBTQ youth, experiencing homelessness and providing community-based training before launching his own company, Transpire Trainings and Consultings LLC, in 2019. In addition, LJ has also spent over a decade in community organizing space. He co-launched the first peer-to-peer support space for trans people in Miami in 2009, has served or led in the TransCon Planning Committee, and almost every year since inception has also co-led Miami's Transgender Day of Remembrance and Resilience for years. In the wake of COVID-19, LJ partnered with several community organizers, most notable Logan Meza, Jamie Odubahir, Frisia McKee, and co-created the COVID-19 South Florida Mutual Aid Coalition. This entirely grassroots equity-driven effort is serving as a rapid response resource network and providing limited assistance for those in greatest need to support in the wake of the pandemic. LJ also serves on several advisory boards and is involved with multiple research projects and initiatives relating to transgender, non-binary health and wellness, and is current Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Culture of Health leader and a Point Foundation alumni. He also has 3 cats. And he's a perpetual negotiations about possibly adopting a dog. Wow. Well, welcome.
Thanks, Niki.
Yes, absolutely. And we have a couple people live with us. We have Deborah Kerr saying hello from her sofa. That's the great place to be. And G saying good evening. And we have Nicholas Zantop. Hey, Nikki and LJ. Hello, Nicholas. So, wow, that is a lot of work. Where did you start? How did you start getting into all of these wonderful work that you're doing?
Yeah, well, I think my career, if you want to call it that, I don't even know if that's the right term, in community organizing really began, as it said in my bio. It's over a decade now. It's hard to believe we're in 2020. So about 11 years ago, when I began my transition, I looked around the community, which is very different than it is now in terms of resources and spaces that were available for people who were exploring gender. And I said to myself, at the time, what I was going through, in a lot of ways, I feel like I was gaslighting myself. I wasn't sure if I, wanted to transition or if I should. I was very, very worried about losing community and friends and even family. And so, I reached out to a very dear friend of mine and said, what's possible? Like, what can we create in the realm of serving trans people? Because, I need resources, and I know that I can't be the only one. And this person who I have come to love very, very much, named Luke, said, well, I'm actually launching a social space for trans and gender creative or gender diverse folks. And so maybe there's a way to kind of team up and combine forces. And so that's exactly what we did. We co-launched the group True, which became both a social and support space for people who were trans or transitioning or exploring gender in some way. And that's really where I got my starts. It's actually my start. It's actually how I ended up meeting people at the Alliance for GLBTQ Youth, where I would later work on the Youth Homelessness Project. And so I think in a lot of ways, true, and creating that network is what built community around me, and it's what has allowed me to support others in building community around them as well.
Okay. And I have Orlando Gonzalez saying hi. And G saying such amazing work. Big up LJ, all working to make this happen and all working to make this happen. Absolutely. And so I just want to dial back before we kind of dig in, because, we may know some of the terms, but this is a public space and some people may not know. Can you define what is trans and non-binary, or what's the definition for you?
Yeah, so, I do training work as a big part of my life. And so I define trans as anyone who identifies as any gender other than the one that they were assigned at birth. I mean, the reality is that most of us were raised believing there's only two genders. And the reality is there is a whole lot more. In fact, I would almost say that gender is infinite, especially as you look around the world and look at other cultures. Gender is a construct. It's a social construct, and it's rooted in geography and place. It's rooted in a lot of different things, including social norms and customs. And so that's the definition that I use. And certainly, I always say that it's important to honor the definition that each person uses for their own gender. And so, that may be the definition that feels most comfortable for me, but for others, they may have a different definition. And the best way to know how someone defines gender or defines the terms are to ask them,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I read long time ago, it's so interesting because sometimes people have such challenges with the word transgender and non-binary, but actually the Native American cultures, many of them would recognize up to 5 different genders. You also have some, countries in certain parts of Asia where, the person who was either considered bisexual or transgender, there actually was like a blessing, and some felt they're actually more godlike because they possess, in the case of bisexuality, both genders inside of themselves. So there's so many different cultures that honor it. So we're just kind of like, we're progressing, but it's really going back to things that was already there and kind of rehashing that.
Yeah, and I think it's really important, to also denote like the difference between gender and sexuality. Like you were just mentioning bisexuality, and that's actually what happens a lot, right? People collapse sexual orientation and gender identity, and now we certainly, the more that we say LGBTQ, right? It comes out almost like its own word. We've collapsed these two things that are both very, very different. Gender identity is really about how I feel about my gender, whereas sexual orientation is about attraction. And so, again, definitions really vary from person to person, and what it looks like across culture gets even more, more and more complex. And so, particularly in indigenous communities, as you were mentioning, the term often used is two-spirit. And so that's having both that blend of masculine and feminine within you. But I always caution folks, especially white folks, that's a term that really is sacred to indigenous communities. And so while we may feel that we are also of that blend of masculine and feminine, I always caution people, not to use or appropriate that term. As well. So, and I think that's an important distinction, just because that class happens so often, and the struggles are not one and the same for trans people and queer folks. There really are vastly different experiences in regards to transition versus, coming out or exploring your sexual orientation or relationship orientation even.
What are some of the misconceptions that you've come across in this work when it comes, as it relates to trans people, trans youth, non-binary?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of them right there, that we're all just gay, right? I think it's unfortunate that terms like the gay community, or phrases like that are used so often, because they're really blanket and sort of umbrella, but don't speak to the individual experiences that people have. And especially around gender, it really is such a journey not that it's not a journey around sexual orientation. I mean, I'm as queer as they come, so I can really speak to both of those experiences. But particularly with gender, it's a very, very different journey. There's just so many intricate decisions that one has to make. You may inherently know that you're trans, but then the question is, how much do I want to alter my body, or my social perception that people have around me may relate directly to my body, and how much do I want to engage the medical industrial complex in transitioning? That's a really individual decision, and one that's not made lightly, and certainly one that's not made oftentimes without immense privilege. People aren't often able to transition that want to transition for socioeconomic reasons, right? Just not having the access, or not having providers that they can trust around them. So I would say there are tons and tons of misconceptions. Trans people are often over sexualized, or it's assumed that all trans people are sex workers. Recently, in conversation, someone said to me that all trans people are angry. And, the reality is, we're like, not all trans and non-binary folks are angry. Many of us have suffered some really difficult and traumatic experiences, sometimes with social services providers, or seeking medical care, or in therapy. So, again, that's partially why that distinction between gender and sexual orientation is so important, because we're not all just gay, and this isn't about sex. It's not about who we partner with. Those things are all certainly important, but they're just very, very different from one's journey around gender. And then how we, get to a place of affirming ourselves and loving ourselves and our bodies is like really unique for each trans person, and really complex. And so, I mean, I could talk about stereotypes and misconceptions all day, but I also know that we only have like so.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, we could always have you back to dig deeper into some of the topics. We have Tracy Carswell saying, such a great convo. Thanks, Niki and LJ.
Thanks for stopping by, Tracy.
Yes, absolutely. And so you also have done a lot of work with LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness, and trans youth. What drew you to that sector of the community to provide services, or to help with them?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. And LGBTQ youth homelessness work has become a really big part of my life. Though I'm not engaged in a direct service capacity at the moment, I'm still very much involved in that work. And it's a really big part of what I believe to be my purpose. I will say very, transparently that I was looking for a position in LGBTQ work. I didn't know exactly what. I've always been drawn to social justice topics. Even as a child, I think I grew up thinking things were very unfair, and I was, tapped into some inequities or understanding of what I guess we probably would have called inequality back then, based on just where I grew up and the neighborhoods that I grew up in and the schools that I went to. And so I think I've always inherently known that I'm drawn to work in and around topics that relate to justice and social justice, but I wasn't sure exactly where I wanted to be. And when this position emerged, the program was being launched in 2013, the first of its kind in Miami-Dade County. And when the position was posted, I remember poring over it. I read it and reread it, and it spoke to me, and I honestly didn't think I had a shot. I reached out to the organization directly that posted the position, and I said, really honestly, like, I don't know if I have the skill set. And I'm also not bilingual, which is a real hindrance in Miami-Dade County, and it's important. And I lost a lot of that. I was very close to being able to speak great Spanish in college, and just sort of lost that capacity because I wasn't practicing. And so I thought that would be a hindrance. And I will never forget the moment when my first clinical supervisor called and said, we're giving you the job. I was in traffic, and I got out of my car and spun around a couple times. And so there was just something about the role that I knew that it meant a lot, and that it was going to do, that particular person was going to do some really important and meaningful and probably challenging and complex work. And all of those things really spoke to me. But also just feeling, and I told this to Steve Rothhaus in 2013 when he interviewed me about the position. I had always sort of felt emotionally, like I didn't have a home in a lot of ways. And home has become a really complex a thing for me that I didn't really experience that true feeling of home until later in life. And so, just trying to imagine the experience of legitimate homelessness, and always feeling like I needed to do more, around this particular topic. So, um, yeah, it really spoke to me, and I'm forever grateful. It changed the course of my life to be offered the role, um, and I know that I'm going to continue to do this work in a variety of capacities in years to come. So.
Awesome, awesome. And we have a couple comments. We have DJ Kevin Stew saying greetings and salutations to all. Greetings. Thanks for joining us. We also have Johada saying love LJ and love Nikki. Yes, love you too. Thank you all for being here. So we're talking to LJ Woolston. Please, if you know him, drop some comments. If you have questions, definitely add some questions. We are live on Facebook on Niki Lopez Creative. We're also live on Outclick Magazine on Facebook, as well as YouTube and Periscope. So let's just dive into your company, Tradings and Consulting LLC. What is that? What made you start it?
Yeah, so one of the very first things in the youth homelessness work that I was doing with Project Safe, one of the things that was immediately clear to me, but certainly made clear to me by my amazing supervisors that I had at the time, Carla and Denise, was the need for training. We can love up on our young people as queer and trans folks doing this work, being in social services or social justice spaces. We can love up on our young people all day. And they came to us, oftentimes in extreme crisis. And it doesn't matter how affirming I am if the moment I send a young person to a shelter space or to a service provider, if the ball is dropped there, if they're treated in ways that don't honor their humanity or their dignity, I haven't actually done my full job. And so I think it's incumbent upon people who do social services work, when you have an opportunity to provide education and advocacy, that get done. And so
Mhm.
one of the biggest pieces of the project that emerged very early, I would say within a matter of 1 to 2 months, was the need for training. We can't, in good faith, send young people or anyone who's in crisis or experiencing homelessness to a service provider that is going to cause them more harm, whether that be, emotional or otherwise. And so, with the need for training being so big, we started piloting a 4-part series of trainings with mostly shelter providers, but all types across all sectors. And so that really gave me my roots in doing training work. I have other experiences in the past of engaging speaking, facilitation, and training in different ways, but particularly around trans, non-binary topics and sexual orientation topics. That work really emerged for me organically in the work of youth homelessness. And so, as a component of that work, I think I developed a really unique skill set. Just in being able to engage large rooms of people, sometimes people that are not happy to see you, not happy that
Mm.
they're mandated sometimes to attend trainings. And so, you know, folks are a little wild sometimes, right? Come with all kinds of pushback or insensitivities or questions. But I think by and large, most of that comes not from malice or from a place of, people being, bad people. It comes from a lack of education. It comes from a lack of awareness. It comes from a lack of understanding. And so having the gift of being able to provide that knowledge to so many service providers over the years, and especially with organizations that engaged in the multi-part of that process, and actually completed all 4 steps,
Mhm.
we were able to see like the change in not only people but in organizations that we were partnering with was tremendous. And so, when I stepped away from direct service at the end of 2018, I knew that this particular part of my work, while the direct service has been on pause, needed to continue. Not only because I feel like, it's so incredibly needed in the community, but it's also something that I particularly enjoy, and I actually do think that it's something I'm pretty good at. And I have a hard time with self promotion and lifting myself up. And so this is an area where I said, I know I'm making an impact because I see it and I hear it and I read those feedback forms, and I know that people are telling me these trainings changed my life.
Mm.
People don't write that on a form because you made them, and so, feeling like that I had gotten the experience and the gift of being able to provide others with education and tools around, specifically around gender, I needed to continue that work in some way. And so that's how Transpire Trainings and Consulting was born. And it was born very quickly in 2019. I only took a few months to really plan and brainstorm and figure out how I wanted to proceed in that work and how I wanted it to look. And most recently, I mean, the intention has always been to expand the work. Obviously, with COVID, that's very challenging. Usually, I'm in rooms with a lot of people. But recently, Transpire did was awarded a competitive bidding contract with AIDS Healthcare Foundation. And as part of that work, I knew it was important to expand and to also bring on other people. That's been the vision from day one. And so recently added Jack Jordan, who's one of my non-binary siblings, to the work. And especially because they'd had some experience with AHF, I think their lens is always valuable. But it's particularly valuable in this situation because they spent some time working in the organization. And who best to provide insight, tools, and awareness to an organization than someone who's actually worked in that space.
Absolutely. Thank you. And congratulations on the recognition. We have DJ Kevin Stu. Thank you, LJ, for showing people how to have acceptance through enlightenment. And then we have a really big comment from Tabitha. Hello, happy to see you on the interwebs. Questions. Can you share your knowledge and perspective on the description a person of transgender experience as an all-encompassing term? It can touch on the term POC, person of color, whereas some people don't desire to attach themselves to that. I'm asking this as I've heard that in many different relations to this and would like to be as informed as I can. That was a mouthful. Thank you.
That needed a swig of soda water.
Yeah.
This is a kind of question that I might get in a training with people who are at a 200 or 300 level. And hi, Tabitha. People who have been around the conversation of gender and orientation for some time. And it's a nuanced question, especially because the concept, or the identities around race were raised in the question. And so first and foremost, I can't really speak to what it's like to be a person of color and to want to either be seen as a person of color or to divest from that label. And also appreciate that there is some parallelism here with regards to trans experience, in that there are definitely trans people who want to be seen as trans. For some of us, it's really important to who we are and how we navigate the world to almost, some people call it passing as trans or being perceived as trans. While there are other trans people who say, I'm someone of transgender history, or I'm someone of transgender experience. Or I'm masculine of center. There's so many different ways that people talk about and describe their gender, and may or may want to divest from certain types of language. And so for me, it kind of comes back to something I said earlier. I have my experience of gender, and I do want to be seen as trans. Being trans has made me in a lot of ways who I am. It's endeared a lot of people to me. I think I understand many of human struggles, more than I would have had I not transitioned. But at the same time, for others, being stealth may be their desired way of experiencing and living their gender in the world. And there is no wrong way. And it's unfortunate, I think, and we do this in so many areas, as human beings, but, we make other people wrong for how they experience their own identities, right? And so, and I see this happen as well, certainly in POC communities and Black communities. It's, as the question has been raised by Tabitha, I see it a lot. And particularly with trans folks, I see a lot of like stealth shaming, right? Like, if you're not out, you're not really trans. And like, that's just not true. There are so many reasons that people aren't out as well. Like, I've had the gift and the privilege of being out and in some ways becoming professionally queer and trans. Like, not everybody has that experience. And some people have really deep-seated reasons, including internalized transphobia for why that they are not out. And there's nothing wrong, in one way or another about how people express their gender, how they transition. It's unfortunate that I think we do a lot of like not trans enough, or, you're not trans enough, not Black enough, or you're not POC enough, or you're not queer enough, or you're not all the things. And it just doesn't leave a lot of space for people to have their own experience. And so for me, I want to be seen as trans. As I said, it's really important to me. Some ways transitioning medically, even though I've done it very gradually with intention, I'm on a very low dose of tea and have been for a very long time. That's not everyone's experience. You know, I want to be seen as trans, and in some ways, you know, now feel like I pass some of the time, a good portion of the time, as a cisgender male. And there's something about that uh, experience of being invisible in some ways, that's really painful. And so, you know, for me, um, I'm trans, and I'm really out about it. And it's just it's who I am, and I think I knew at a very young age before I even had the language. But I'm really intentional that that doesn't make someone who's stealth or who says I have a trans history or I don't want to be seen as trans. That doesn't make them bad or wrong. You know, that's just their experience of their gender and the environment around them and their upbringing, all the things that make us human. So many things go into making that decision.
Absolutely. And I put in the Facebook a couple of links to the website and to the Facebook and the Instagram. So definitely check it out. What is one thing that you, if somebody wanted to support your work, how do they do that? What's a way to either do that or get in contact with you?
You're right. 30 minutes goes by really fast.
Yes.
That last question was a doozy. I'm not even sure I answered it well. Um, you know, so in the wake of COVID, you know, as a social worker, I think a lot of social workers experience this sense of how can I make myself the most useful with the lens that I have around equity, particularly health equity, racial disparities. And in the pandemic, how do you make use of your skill set if you do equity work? That was the question I asked myself. How do I make use of this skill set that I have that in a lot of ways is on hiatus, right? I'm not engaged in direct service. I launched a training business. I was just on the precipice of some really juicy things. And now a lot of that is on pause. And so I took a step back, and I've seen what other communities have done, particularly around mutual aid. And I said, hey, like, this is maybe a way that I can lend the skills that I've developed working in nonprofit space and in homelessness space and queer and trans space and community organizing, all the things that make up me, and use it to benefit, you know, other people around me, recognizing that I'm one person with two hands who can only do so much, but knowing that there's a rich tapestry of folks around me who I love and trust. And so I just put it into the ether and said, hey, you know, is anyone interested in throwing down for creating a mutual aid network in South Florida? It exists in lots of other cities. Why don't we have one here? And was pleasantly surprised by the number of responses that, you know, that communication received. And so we launched the COVID-19 South Florida Mutual Aid Coalition. And we recognize that while these are just Band-Aids that we're, you know, really putting on some really massive struggles, it's still a Band-Aid that's needed. So, you know, right now we were able to, thankfully, we were awarded a grant from our fund, which is allowing us to really step up the amount of aid that we can provide to folks. It's being done on a case-by-case basis. It's entirely equity-centered, equity-driven, meaning that folks who have overlapping oppressed identities are more likely to receive aid and or a greater amount of aid. You know, and the attempt here is to really create something that fills some gaps, because we know that organizations are overloaded, sometimes fall short even under the best of conditions. And so how can we, as organizers, use the skills, again, that we have and the resource we have and the leverage we have, the privilege we have, the communities we're a part of, to really create something that allows us to rely on one another rather than on institutions that, unfortunately, many times, especially that, you know, we're seeing this now. I think, you know, social workers look at this all the time, but I think now, you know, the lay folks are going, oh my gosh, like this, it's not right that more Black folks are dying from COVID than white folks. It's not right that certain people were able to get testing very early on and other people are still waiting in figurative testing lines even now. And so I think as people are beginning to engage these conversations more often around inequities, you know, it's really important to also have some actual places to go to get resources and support. And so the platform has grown to over, I think we have 900 people on the Facebook group now. It can be found on Facebook. But the number one way, in response to your question, that we can be supported right now is through funds. You know, this number two way there, and the Cash App is there. You know, the number two way is by people who want to organize with us. You know, we started, I think, with about 15, and that number has continued to dwindle. And I think it's really because we're all experiencing a lot, various layers of grief and overwhelm, and sadness and frustration and job loss and all the things. And so we still need, more warm bodies.
Mm.
We need more people to bring their insight, their energy, their creativity, um, their willingness to engage in some work that is new, and I'd call it new and imperfect, right? That's what grassroots work is. It's imperfect. It doesn't need to look like anything else that exists. It doesn't need to look a particular way. And we're literally, people say, building the plane as you fly it a lot. That applies here. We are building the plane as we fly it, and the folks you named at the beginning of the call have very much been there every step of the way. Logan, Frisia, and Jamie have been incredible in their willingness to continue to engage. But we definitely need more people, and we definitely need funding to continue this work. Even though we have the grant from our fund, uh, we received the first disbursement this past Thursday, and I would say that we have gone through almost the entirety of those funds, in a very short period of time. And so we have more disbursements on the way, thanks to Equality Florida, who's the fiscal for this and managing it, making sure that we get the funds in a timely manner. But the moment that those funds came in, they've gone right back out, because we have people who are in need. We have undocumented folks, we have queer folks, trans folks, who are saying, I'm rationing medication, or I'm not picking up medication, or I'm totally out of groceries. And in one case, some folks were all in one household, undocumented and positive for COVID, so they're not going to distribution sites for food. And if you don't have a reliable vehicle, and most of those resources are car transportation driven, so that's the thing. That's the work that we're doing, really, is filling gaps. And so in any way that people want to support us in filling those gaps, we're all ears. I also don't tell people how to volunteer, or how to best lend themselves to an effort. If something speaks to you, if you want to be involved on the logistics side, if you want to be somebody who's helping us improve our process, if you want to be someone who manages data or forms, or you just want to give funding because you believe in what we're doing and you trust that people who are part of communities know their communities best, all of those things are amazing ways to support us.
Absolutely. And let me get a couple of comments through, because I know we're wrapping up soon. We have G saying, congratulations on launching so quickly and for getting the Our Fund grant. And then we had a comment in here by Johada. So she says, I got kicked off due to my internet, but to a youth who is at a hotel now and receiving food that wouldn't happen if he didn't get the ball rolling. So I'm appreciative of that.
Thanks, Jahara. Thanks for the work that you continue to do as well.
Yes, absolutely.
I've been in each other's lives for a minute, and I'm very grateful for her and all that she continues to do with young people as well. So
absolutely. And then Orlando had a question. He said, homeless older adults, particular immigrants, often seek help who are non-binary. What's the best place for them to receive housing support?
That's a great question. If we're talking about the landscape of Miami-Dade, I feel like I can really speak to what's available, and often, sadly, not available in shelter space. But if we're talking about older adults right now, our continuum of care in Miami-Dade County and the Homeless Trust has pivoted. I know we're all probably pretty sick of that term pivot these days, but they've pivoted to ensure that their standard operating procedure shifts to really include the needs of older adults. Since we know that folks who are older are more likely to be immunocompromised and or be unable to healthily survive COVID. So there are increased resources available right now for older adults. For folks who are non-binary, that's an intersection here that we don't talk about enough. I'm really grateful for the work of organizations, particularly SAGE, SAGE USA, that really works on the needs of older adults who are transitioning or who are non-binary, who are oftentimes forgotten in our conversation. We spend a lot of time talking about young people, but we don't spend nearly as much of our time thinking about those who paved the way for us to exist. And so in terms of what resources are available, I would say that's one where I'd say email me. Like, my contact information is all there. I know we're wrapping up the call. There are certainly, I will say very, candidly, there are certainly some shelter spaces that are safer and more affirming than others. But by and large, the continuum of care right now has increased the amount of resources available for older adults across all identities in Miami-Dade County. Broward is more difficult for me to speak to. I don't have a ton of direct experience with Broward. and had a really challenging experience trying to get someone into housing last week in Broward, and know that, by and large, the housing resources in Broward are slimmer than they are in Dade. One thing I'll say, it's interesting that Orlando asked about older adults, because usually they're the ones left out of the conversation. But right now, as a youth homelessness advocate, I would say it's actually young people who are left out of the conversation right now. We expect that young people are going to be healthy. They're going to survive if they get COVID. It'll be no big thing. It'll be like a cold, and they'll be in and out. And that's actually not really, that's really not true. Young people experiencing homelessness are incredibly transient. They're moving all around the county, as they often are. I don't think COVID has stopped a lot of young people from, who are on the street from moving around the county. And so they're actually, in my opinion, at greater risk in some ways of contracting COVID. And then we can't speak to whether or not their body is going to respond in a particular way to this, to this virus. And so for me, one of the things that, I've been talking about with folks that I'm in community with, and do organizing work with around homelessness, particularly the Grand Challenge folks. We're doing some really great work with the Ride or Die team in Miami-Dade called the Grand Challenge, really looking at youth homelessness among youth of color and LGBTQ youth, and also making sure that young people's voices are included in our work, because they're often not. We do a lot of things for young people, not with young people or alongside young people. And right now, being connected to other communities across the country, I can really say that, there's been incredible movement around youth homelessness. But with COVID, it is pretty universal right now that communities across the country are having to remind, and organizers are having to remind their local continuum of care that LGBTQ youth, youth of color, youth experiencing homelessness are more likely to be transient, more likely to be moving around the city, and thus much more likely to be contracting COVID. And we need to be creating carve-out resources for youth in this moment, not just older adults. That narrative was presented week 1 and 2 and has been particularly damaging to some of our youth homelessness efforts, I think. And so just because that question is one that we don't normally get asked, right? I wanted to address that. I think that young people have been left out of this conversation in a way that's almost flipped. Usually it's the opposite. Usually I'm having to remind people about aging folks in the community who are, that's a population that's just so often invisible. And right now in this moment, young people who are typically invisible on the street, but who have become much more part of our conversations around homelessness, have almost been left out. There's the assumption that they're going to be healthy, they're going to be all right, and we don't have to worry about them. And that's just absolutely not the case at all, especially with the health disparities and the differences, the disproportionate impact of COVID on communities of color. So if we're not talking about that, and we're not having that conversation when we know that the majority of young people experiencing homelessness are youth of color or are LGBT or both, just keep stacking up those layers when we talk about intersectionality. If we're not thinking about them right now and how this particular situation in the pandemic might be affecting them disproportionately, differently, I think we're missing the mark. And so we really need to be doing that across all subpopulations. How is this more likely to be, how is this likely to impact young people, especially those who are transient or experiencing homelessness or living in unstably housed situations? How is it likely to impact older adults? But to Orlando's question, back to where we began, we're talking about housing. I could talk a long time. Anybody who knows me knows I can talk a lot in general. It's one of my things I like to talk. I think it's a case-by-case situation, but I certainly do have the ability to reach out into the continuum of care and to, partners, community partners, people who do the work, and make sure that, if there is someone specific that you're asking that question about, that we, provide this person with resources and get them connected to care and to shelter. And we know that the resources are there now more than they usually are, for older adults at least.
Awesome. Thank you. And I just want to, because I know we're going a little bit over, but people are engaged, asking questions. So, hopefully that's okay with you. But I want to there are some comments that I want to address. And I know Tabitha says she has some extra questions, but I want to throw it out there. So the group that we're talking about is South Florida Mutual Aid Coalition social media. So it's COVID-19 South FL Mutual Aid. There is a link in the comments on Facebook. If you're wanting to give financial support, there's a Cash App, which is $sign South FL Mutual Aid. So there's the email, South flmutualaid@gmail.com. So definitely look at the links. They'll be in the comments of the video. It's also in the main post to get involved. I wanted to go back. So DJ Kevin Stew, and I was just on his channel last week. He was talking to a few trans identified people, and he's an ally. So he's just wanted to get have his own questions, get people acclimated. He put a part of the struggle, in my opinion, is the labels. So what can you say for people who may want to be, they're an ally, but they're just not, we are setting our ways. What can you do in terms of the different labels? What can you say to people that's really just trying to understand,
Well, if Shahar is still watching, we have this conversation pretty often. We've talked about it at length, but many of my friends and I have had this conversation at length. There's sort of a couple camps around this. People are either staunchly for labels or staunchly anti-label, because some people have the framework or the mindset that we're all just human. And for me, saying we're all just human, or we're all just people, or we all just have a sexual orientation, or we all just have a gender, is actually it's the equivalent of saying all lives matter. It's really whitewashing. It's really erasure. Labels really do help us find and build community, right? That's one really important thing about labels. Labels also help us find ourselves sometimes. I wouldn't have known much at all about being trans if I didn't have that language to wrap my mind around my experience of my gender. I knew very young, like, you look at the pictures of me, I'm like, Mom, how did you not know? Like, I literally would have my thumbs in my pockets. Like, I'd be grabbing my 6-year-old junk or something. Like, I was always doing something weird. I was always very masculine presenting, even as a child, but I didn't have that language. Had I not met Luke, had I not found early on the Yes Institute, which was doing, providing education around gender and orientation, had I not found spaces that were starting to have these conversations, or that were having them regularly, I would never have been able to untangle my gender mess. And I may have died from that. We have many people who experience gender in all kinds of ways that can be very confusing, daunting, overwhelming. And with our society being structured the way that it is, we're very likely to resist and have these internal battles. And so for me, labels and language are critical. We cannot name oftentimes ourselves, our experiences, the world around us without labels. And it's inherently human to label everything. Can you imagine going grocery shopping if they removed the labels from everything in the store? Good luck getting what you want to eat. Labels are really important. They help us find each other. They help us find ourselves. But in addition, the other really big piece about language that I think is not spoken about, and it's something I talk a lot about, being part of Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and being part of the Culture of Health Leaders program, being in this amazing cohort with a total of 40 of us, but 39 other brilliant people working on public health in some way. If we don't have language, we cannot talk about inequity. Language helps us define what is not working. Language helps us see that there are people who do not have the same level of access, privilege, resources, all the things to navigate life in the same ways that other people do. And if we don't make distinctions, how can we talk about that? So I get that labels can be confounding. They can be overwhelming. They can seem almost separatist in some ways. But I think they're incredibly important, especially right now. We're thinking about a pandemic. And again, we're having these conversations, some people for the first time, and thinking about inequities for the first time. For someone like me who's been thinking about this as long as I understood the difference between right and wrong, fair and unfair, just and unjust, I'm like, no one wanted a pandemic, but if it takes a pandemic for others to see that we are not all on equal footing, that's what it's going to take. And one can only hope that this horrible tragedy that so many families have been hit by, particularly families of color, particularly families with folks who are older, particularly with families who have immunocompromised people in their families who have lost folks, one can only hope that all these lives were not lost in vain. One can only hope that we continue to have difficult and complex conversations around race, around gender, around class, around health, and around the intersections between all of those things,
Mm-hmm.
right? But we can't do that if we say all lives matter. We can't do that if we say all genders are the same. We can't do that if we say your sexual orientation is the same as mine or your struggle is the same as mine. We're all just human. No, I'm so sorry. Yes, we are all just human, but no, we do not all have the same experience of the world. And so, some organizations and some folks who do this work will say that we're moving away from terms like LGBTQ and we don't use those terms anymore. I say that's really dangerous because if we don't talk about the fact that folks who are lesbian identified are more likely to suffer from sexual violence, if we don't talk about the bisexual people who are often invisible or who are told you're confused, this is just a bridge to being realizing that you're actually gay. If we don't talk about the fact that trans people are seen, as I said earlier, as only sex workers or all angry or just confused, particularly trans children get that a lot. And if we don't talk about the differences between being queer and being gay, and what does it mean to be queer, and why did I choose that language? It's really deeply meaningful to me to have chosen to identify as queer. Do I think that I was innately queer? Yes, actually, I do. I don't think that it is a choice, but the choice in how I name that is really, really unique to me. And again, helps me find like-minded people who have carried me through the loss of my own partner. If I didn't have a broad trans community who got the experience of wanting to take your own life, I don't know that I would have survived my partner's suicide. My partner, we haven't talked about that, but my partner was trans identified, a trans and non binary woman, a gender non-conforming trans woman. Um, Talk about having to overperform standards of femininity for someone who was trans, identified as a woman, but was also often masculine presenting. If I didn't have other trans people to lean on through that crisis, which still in many ways is a big part of my life, grieving is not done. Grieving doesn't happen in a vacuum or in a cup. It's not over because I hit year 2. I'm going on just over 3 years here. And I recognize that Diana's story and our relationship and all that she taught me and her activism, I'm always going to wear that like my skin. So I could talk a lot about language and labels, but for me, that question is very much rooted in the same sentiment that we're all the same. And yes, I do believe fundamentally as human beings, our core is the same, but our experience of the world is not, and our access is not. And until every single human being on this planet has the same level of access, I can't get behind the all lives matter stuff. I can't get behind the, let's just do away with all the labels. Because if I can't talk about there being a 50% chance of a trans person taking their life over someone who's not trans identified, how do we have that conversation then? How do we have the conversation around disparities, around suicidality, around homelessness, around homicide, right? Anti-trans violence. Every year, it says there in my bio, but for the last, 7 years, I've been part of the Transgender Day of Remembrance and Resilience in Miami-Dade County. And building that workout year over year and watching the numbers rise and hearing the stories and reading the stories of more and more trans people who have either taken their life or had their life brutally snatched from them. We can't talk about that if we don't have the word trans in our vocabulary. And we can't talk about it if we don't have the word non-binary in our vocabulary. And so I think it's actually very damaging for organizations and for people who want to really do away with labels. If folks don't want to use labels for themselves, that is a unique privilege and a right. But to remove or to suggest that we would be better if all people were just the same, yeah, that's great. It's a pie in the sky. I told someone last week, that's a fairy tale. And when we get there, give me a buzz. I'm ready. When we get there, I'm ready to talk about rainbows and unicorns and fairy tales and all kinds of things. But until then, I'm going to keep saying trans. I'm going to keep saying non-binary. I'm going to keep saying Black. I'm going to keep saying person of color. I'm going to keep saying disabled, undocumented, and all the things. Because that's how we talk about disparities, inequities, and people not having the same level of access to life and rights and dignity that other people have. We just can't have those conversations without them. I know that was a bit of a rant. Someone like that question.
No, this is good. You have people. You got Joe Hada. She's making brownies and eating the and listening to the conversation. Tracy's making popcorn. Everybody's still here. Marcia said, great
Oh,
job. And said, awesome. I love LJ. His respect, love, and commitment to community is amazing. Love you, dear.
oh,
Um, so, we have a couple of comments. Call me a label whore, but I'm about them. That's what from Johada. Yeah, visibility matters. For some youth that's like looking, or adults is like, I don't know what I am. Or I just don't feel right as who everybody thinks I am. Yes, you need that. G said labels very important. Yes, but there's a lot of policing regarding labels within the LGBT community. Let folks be.
yeah. And I think we talked about that a little bit earlier, right? And that's why I always make that like sort of an asterisk, right? This is my stance, and I think that language and labels are very, very important, and it's nuanced. However, it is not okay to police how other people identify, whether that be self or of trans history or of trans experience. And it's not up to us, how others identify. And so even in training work, I put up all the words that I say folks should never say, but please don't go tell a trans person not to say that word about themselves. Because it's
Absolutely.
not up to you to decide if somebody wants to use language that you may find or I may find on the regular offensive. It's not up to you or me or anyone else to decide. And so to G's point, yes, there is a ton of policing in the community around labels and language, and telling folks, you're not trans, or you're not trans enough, or you're not really non-binary. We haven't really even talked about, the difference between being trans and non-binary, but there is a whole lot of struggle right there too, right? We have trans people who have medically transitioned, some who say I'm a transsexual or I'm a real transsexual. And so how is it okay for this person to get access to the spaces or the services that are carved out for me as a trans person? And it's complex, right? Like, particularly with folks who are older and of different generations who went through a totally different struggle than we have as younger trans folks. I'm approaching 40 here. I'm 36, but people always say I look like I'm like 20 something. I don't think so. I have wrinkles coming in on my forehead here. I think we need to honor that for folks of different generational experiences. Labels and language would be very different. Their experience of their lives might be very different. And so they may react in a particular way to our use of language, in ways that may like surprise us. And at the same time, I'm all about folks who have got us to where we are. So, I think we say a lot of times, you'll hear a lot of like, what I almost equate to like hate speech, even within our own communities. We eat our own a lot. We really, really eat our own. And it's a struggle and a journey I've been on as an advocate. How do I, as an advocate and an activist, both, because I feel like those live in almost different camps for me now. When I'm an advocate, I am engaged in bridge building, right? And then in the hopes of providing resources and access for others. And when I'm an activist, that may look a whole lot different, and sometimes caution to the wind. But figuring out that balance, that it's an ongoing struggle for me personally. What is the difference between advocacy and fighting? And I think there's a place in our movements for advocates and fighters, and some of us come in and out of advocacy and fighting at different times, and all of that is okay.
Absolutely. Johada says, I'm black, I'm a woman, I'm queer, I'm an immigrant. She's also Jewish. Add that label to my salad, and my BMI is over 40. Add that shit too. Okay.
Right. But like, what she just said was really important and really ties into the conversation we're having.
Yeah.
Like, how
Yeah.
do all of those labels for Jahara, her experience of the world, how did that journey equate to her BMI being over 40, right? Like, let's really talk about health inequities and how those inequities intersect and overlap with our identities, and I think that's really important. And Jahara is someone who's very close to me, so I could speak to her experience. This is not the space. I know she's been on the show as well, but we talk about stuff like this, and my comrades and friends, especially folks in public health work or social justice work, community organizing. These are conversations we're having all the time. How do our identities intersect with our actual real life experience, and the ways in which we receive or don't receive access, again, to programs, to services, spaces, workplaces, you name it.
Okay. So we have the last question before we wrap up. This has been great. Awesome conversation. Thank you all who is watching this live. Please consider sharing this, tagging people. The link is there. People need to get this information out, and you could actually be a part of that, getting the information out. So we have a final question from Tabitha Mudra. She says, off topic, personal question. Post transition, are there any moments or stories that you notice through the perception of others having the duality? For example, if I approach a woman with a child and compliments them, is it very acceptable for the most part, or your clarity in choice making, example, grocery store, list making, etc.? Are there any locker room or boys will be boys experience you could speak to? I hope this is clear.
Oh, Tabitha. Somebody who writes as many words as I do. This is another great question. You know, I thought about it earlier, kind of flashed through my mind what my experience of the world has been pre and I won't even say post transition, but since I began my transition. Yes, the world relates to me differently. I will say, when my hair is longer like this is my COVID hair, and I tried to cut it myself today, but Orlando knows that didn't work out the last time he happened to see me when I had a big old line on my head. I'm trying to fix my own hair, but when my hair grows out, I start to get misgendered. It's an interesting experience of the world, and seeing how people relate to me, especially lately. I've been going into a lot of grocery stores, and I have a mask on my face, which is hiding my facial hair, that I think is often how people perceive me as male. Um, Even though I don't identify as a man, I do identify as male. And when this is covered, I think my bone structure, my eyes, maybe, my gaze, whatever it may be, I'm getting misgendered more often in facial coverings as well. So it's been an interesting experience. But yes, the world perceiving me differently has me perceive the world differently, and sort of living, even though I do identify as non-binary, I'm really rooted in my female socialization and experience. People will tell you I squeal at kittens and babies and all types of things. And with this question, I will say that it has been difficult to have people in elevators pull their children closer to them. It has been difficult to have people perceive me as a white man, or it has been difficult to have people perceive me as another disgusting guy, or whatever, a lot of the stereotypes we have attached to what's actually toxic masculinity, right? It isn't masculinity. Masculinity is actually very pure, right? And we talked a little bit about indigenous communities earlier, but like, masculinity is not a bad thing, right? The masculine principle in itself, if you look at it, of strength or of providing or of all the things that might be attached to masculinity are not inherently bad. It's toxic masculinity, right? That is the problem, right? It's that over assertion or dominance or, all the things. I could talk a lot about masculinity and particularly toxic masculinity. Those are the things that are a problem. And so I think I, as a transmasculine person, have been sort of on the crap end of the stick of that, in that with the world perceiving me in this particular way, oftentimes now, not always, but oftentimes, again, I have those experiences of men potentially, like, I think this is what Tabitha means by the locker room conversation, men seeing me as a sounding board for their toxicity, right? To talk about women or to oogle somebody as, they may walk by. And it's always a challenge for me. Do I come out? Do I challenge this? Do I tell them I'm not down with that? That's not okay. Like, you don't get to objectify women in this way. Particularly how men relate to me has been very, very different. Like, I'll go to order a sub. My friend Tori always makes fun of me. She says I should have a website, ljeatingsubs.com. But I'll go to order a sub and I'll get questions like, do you want double meat? No, I don't want double meat. Did I ask for double meat? I ordered a regular sub. But I think there's stuff tied to that, right? And it gets far more complex and deep than how someone relates to you in a store setting or a restaurant setting. But questions like that, the bro, what do they call it? The bro mentality, or the all of that stuff. I've definitely experienced some of that on sort of the other side of this, and there was no clear point at which that began to happen. Right, gender transitions are very organic, um, but I have certainly experienced men assuming that I'm going to engage in toxic behaviors with them, and that's been a challenge, as well as families or sometimes women or even children perceiving me more as a threat than before, and like that is something that's really difficult, and that ties back into what we said at the beginning about my desire to be seen as trans, to
Mm.
have the whole of my experience around gender seen. In every moment is not possible, but it's sort of like the dream that I have. Like I wish that I like could tell people the journey that I've been on and the journey that so many people I love have been on, and how it isn't what they might perceive, or it certainly hasn't been easy. And I know it's much more difficult for others, particularly trans women and trans women of color, and oftentimes non-binary folks and non-binary folks of color as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you, LJ, so much for being here. We went over by a whole show. But people are on there and engage, and so this is all important information. I love what you're doing. I love your connection to helping people and how you took some of the challenges that you've experienced while finding yourself to say, let me bridge the gap for somebody else who may be in my shoes looking for that information. They don't have to look really hard because I'm creating it for them. So, there is something to be said about what comes out of our pain, what comes out of our lack of, what comes out of our searching for ourselves and healing ourselves, that we're able to impact the world with that. So it's just like a beautiful journey that you take all of those experiences and beautifully transition to what you're doing with the home, youth and LGBT youth of homelessness, and then Transpire, and then COVID. Like they all go together, and they all, you can't really separate them. They just blend so easily. And so I just really want to commend you for your work, your passion. Congrats again on the Our Fund. A lot of times, a lot of support is easily going to these nonprofits that everyone knows. And so it's really refreshing to know that a grassroots organization that I literally saw pop up and is getting recognized for its work financially, that money that could go into the community. And it's just like you said, it's already gone through because you're just, doing the work. So I really appreciate that. We did have links in the comment section. It was wonderful to have you. Thank you for everybody who stayed on. I know we went an hour for the 30-minute show, but everybody was just here with you and engaged, and so I really wanted to keep that up. If you're watching it on the replay, thank you again for watching, and please share this information. A lot of good information here tonight, and thank you so much, LJ, for joining us, and I'll see you around, or definitely, look forward to having you back. And
I would love to. This has been so much less scary than I thought it would be.
Absolutely.
For those who are watching, you didn't get to see me in breakdown prior to the show where I changed my shirt 3 times, but this one worked out okay. The others were.
Yes.
Thank you for bearing with me, Niki,
Absolutely.
and thank you for the work that you continue to do and uplifting voices. Like mine and so many other artists and activists
Absolutely.
and advocates as well, who are out there doing great things. I really appreciate the platform you've created.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much. Tracy says thank you to you both. Absolutely. So, all right. We'll see you all next week. Good
Thanks
night.
everyone who watched. Bye.
Yes. Bye.